Yarn is pretty, and it's expensive. Unless you're always weaving with the same exact yarns over and over and over again, you can end up with lots of odds and ends. This can get carried to the extreme when you inherit or buy the leftovers of somebody else's stash, like what happened to me almost 10 years ago. And yes, I'm still working through some of these yarns. How do you make use of these? Can you put them all together in one warp? Can you weave with multiple kinds of yarn at the same time? In this video, I'll talk about some of the benefits and the drawbacks of mixed yarn warps. Hi, I'm Pamela from Fibersprite.com, and I help fiber artists understand what they really need to know so they can get down to their real passion, actually working with fiber. Most weaving patterns expect that you will use the same yarn across the entire warp. Sure, you might have stripes of a different color, but typically it's all going to be the same brand, the same thickness, the same set all the way across your warp. Sometimes when weavers go really crazy, they might add in one thicker yarn to create a corded texture, but usually everything is pretty consistent across the warp. Why is this? Well, it's easier to do the math, it's faster to set up, but there's also a concept in weaving called differential shrinkage. This means that yarns of different fibers and different constructions tend to shrink differently when they're washed. Usually things with the same fiber content will shrink the same amount, but sometimes things can surprise you. If you're mixing brands and construction, and maybe there's a different fiber in there somewhere that you might not know about, things might behave differently and create something unexpected that you might not like. If you mix very, very different fibers, like merino wool with linen, the merino wool is going to shrink a lot when it's washed. It's just the nature of the fiber. The linen, on the other hand, isn't going to shrink very much. So this is going to create a very dramatic effect. You can use this to your benefit. You can create ruffles, you could create a seersucker effect, you can create all sorts of interesting effects. And this is in fact the basis for deflected double weave. But if you're not expecting it, it can be a big, dramatic, and upsetting moment. Remember that sampling is your friend. Be sure before you embark on a big project to make a small sample and wet finish it so that you kind of have an idea of how those yarns are going to behave. I have a whole blog post and a magazine article about differential shrinkage. So if you're wanting to dive more into those, I'll link to them below. Another reason that weavers might tend to shy away from mixed warps is how elastic or inelastic yarns are. When I wound the warp for this jacket, I found that some of the yarns were really elastic, like this, which is a merino silk blend. It had a lot of stretch to it. Even though it didn't seem to have a lot of stretch when I did my initial testing, it stretched out a lot as I wound the warp on. In contrast, this textured gray yarn, because of the way that it was spun, doesn't have as much stretch because the plies that lock in the texture keep it from stretching very much. I ended up tensioning my warp as I wound it on so that it would be easy enough to weave, but it meant that I had a lot of waste yarn at the end of the warp that I wasn't able to weave because there were different lengths of it. I had to cut it off to be able to start weaving. This is a lot of wasted time, money, and natural resources that you want to avoid if at all possible. I was able to salvage most of that cut off yarn in a separate project, but it really drove home the idea that different levels of stretch are really going to be important when you're working with a mixed yarn warp. If one of your yarns is highly inelastic, it can cause some problems too. This is a top that I wove from a number of different yarns that I inherited, and one of the yarns in here is a linen. The rest are cotton and rayon. The cotton and rayon have a decent amount of stretch, but the linen has very little stretch. What happened was that the linen sprung out of place and didn't want to weave into the structure as I was weaving. This can be solved with a weighted warp end, but you need to be able to see your structure and notice any errors to make sure that this isn't happening. What if you're combining different yarns of the same fiber but of different thicknesses? This is actually a great way to add some texture and interest into your final cloth. However, you do want to be sure and account for those differences in thickness when you go to calculate your set. If you're evenly distributing all of the weights and textures across your warp, then you want to kind of average the recommended sets together. So if I'm going to weave 100 ends, that I would normally weave at 20 ends per inch and another 100 ends that I would normally weave at 10 ends per inch, then all 200 of those, I might average those and do all 200 at 15 ends per inch. You can certainly play with this and weight your averages up or down depending on the type of fabric that you want to produce. One reason that weavers don't necessarily like to work with mixed warps is it creates a lot of layers. If you've got a lot of different warp chains and they're all mixed together, it feels like it's a big opportunity for them to tangle. But what I've noticed is that the multiple warps actually exist in different layers as they're going onto the loom. And if you tension each one of them in its original warp chain, this can actually be a really great way to mix different fibers across your warp. You can do this either warping front to back or back to front. You just need to accommodate all those extra warp chains somehow. Mixed warps are really interesting and fun to work with. As always, be sure to test your yarns for strength and don't forget to sample. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.